Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
First episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording this on Friday the 19th of April, and there's just been reporting of Israeli retaliatory strikes on Iran. We won't touch on these during this podcast, but we will talk about what's been happening in the week. And speaking of the week, Richard, how's your week been? What have you been thinking about, writing about, etc.?
Well, lots and lots has been happening this week. We've obviously been talking, lots of people have been talking about Australian strategy with the release of the National Defence Strategy, lots that we can unpack there. And it almost seems like it was a sort of beyond a week ago, but talking about events in the Middle East, which, as you just touched on, are flagging and flaring up again as we speak. So lots and lots of things to talk about. Also, some really interesting developments in terms of technology, which we'll again try and unpack a little bit. And beyond that, trying to actually do some digging into some of the history behind some of these sorts of things, which is always fun. But trying to do that whilst keeping on top of the busy things that are happening in maritime matters is always a challenge.
It is a challenge, and you're absolutely right. There's been lots on this week, and we're going to try and get into that, talking Australian defence strategy, Australian defence funding, down to operations and some interesting capabilities. Something about sharks with lasers. I think I read the UK is pursuing, not quite.
Jen, the big news of this week, certainly from an Australian defence perspective, is the launch of the new National Defence Strategy and the related integrated investment plan. We've seen lots and lots in print media and interviews from you in terms of your thoughts on this. So I thought perhaps we'd go to you first with your initial impressions of the National Defence Strategy and what are your kind of key takeaways?
Yeah, look, it has been. I guess, there's the 80-page National Defence Strategy. There's 100 pages, allegedly the Integrated Investment Program, which doesn't look like an integrated investment program to me. It looks like a 100-page glossy on funding over 10-year periods. But anyway, look, I guess the key takeaways are certainly the National Defence Strategy was consistent with the Defence Strategic Review, so it really sought to build on this concept of deterrence by denial. But I think it did seek to try and explain a little bit more in terms of what we are trying to deny. And the Deputy Prime Minister was at pains to add during his speech at the Press Club on Wednesday that when you think about, we talked about this in our teaser, when you think about Australia, a lot of our strategic interests don't physically rely on our shores. And so therefore, when you're talking about a strategy for the defence of Australia's interests, you need to be thinking about elements such as power projection, sea control, etc. So that was kind of music to the ears, I think, of those who have long argued that a deterrence by denial strategy, or at least the traditional definition, was not necessarily appropriate for Australia. So I'm not sure if it really is a deterrence by denial strategy, but it's certainly a strategy that recognises the fact that a lot of our vulnerabilities lie off our coast. So I think that was pretty good. In terms of the capabilities, to be honest, there wasn't really a lot new. Certainly in the maritime domain, there was a significant focus, again, on submarines, as you can imagine, $368 billion worth. Although I note that the IIP release was at pains to say it's not $368 billion, it's $53 to $63 billion or something in that magnitude over the next 10 years. Of course, there was further articulation about the expansion of the surface combatant fleet. Not really much more detail there. There was a greater articulation, I thought, of what the maritime domain actually entails. So from a Defence Strategic Review perspective, I guess one of my concerns was when the DSR talked about the investment priorities in the maritime domain, it talked about ships, subs and workforce. That was it. Whereas at least the NDS and the IIP do talk about auxiliaries, although probably not to the satisfaction of most, and we'll get into that in a sec. It does talk about mine warfare and it does talk about hydrography. So as much as it probably doesn't deal with them adequately in terms of how important they are to our maritime domain, at least it acknowledges them, which is, I think, a positive step moving on from the DSR. We see in the IIP that the maritime domain gets the most amount of investment across the IIP, and that's 38% of investment. And then when you break that down, that's about 17% for undersea warfare, maritime capabilities, which the IIP catches as capabilities for sea denial and localized sea control operations, which was an interesting way to kind of catch it. Gets about 16%, right? So we see that in terms of the investment, the large swathe of investment in the integrated investment program over the next 10 years is going towards the maritime domain. Now, that's no surprise when you think about the fact that nuclear-powered submarines are expensive. And also you think about the much-needed recapitalization of the surface combatant fleet, right? And so when you think about the structure of a navy, obviously it's based on platforms that are expensive. So yes, there is more investment into the maritime domain. Some of that, I think, is because the strategy does focus more on the maritime domain. You see in the National Defence Strategy, it talking about Australia as a middle power or a middle maritime power, which causes some consternation whether we are a middle maritime power or potentially a regional maritime power. But
it's got the word maritime in there because, after all, maritime matters, right?
Maritime matters, absolutely. So that's great to see. I was really interested to see the increased investment in uncrewed autonomous vessels, whether that be underwater vessels or surface vessels. It's not a significant amount of money in the IIP, but it does seem to be a real focus. And I guess that is one of the ways the government and defence see that they can mitigate what is the looming gap in capability, right? Because we know that despite the life of type extensions for the Collins-class conventional submarines, the first of the new nuclear-powered submarines is not coming until the early 30s, and that's the Virginia-class. And we know that from a surface combatants perspective, obviously HMAS Anzac will decommission in May, so we go from 11 surface combatants down to 10. And then the NDS says largely expected that HMAS Arunta will decommission in 2026. So though we talk about doubling the surface fleet to support our new deterrence by denial strategy, we're actually reducing the surface fleet really until the early 30s. So it obviously sees that increased autonomy, and we'll get to this when we talk about capability, is a way of addressing some of that, although probably not effectively. What were your takes on the NDS and IRP, Richard?
Broadly speaking, I agree with you. I like the way it does sort of follow a lot of the direction of the DSR, particularly, obviously, we're talking maritime here, and so I obviously pulled up exactly the same quote about Australia being a maritime middle power nation, and we can question about the middle power part, but I think that the maritime part is undeniable, and I think the money then reflects that quite clearly. So I think there's an awful lot to like in there. You've sort of pushed a bit of that, so I'll pull out a couple of things which, to my mind, I have slight issues with. One of them is around this idea of deterrence. So the NDS pulls up the three ideas or sort of themes coming out of the DSU, so the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, to shape, deter and respond. And it states that we ought to be focusing on the deter element, which I can understand why they're talking about this, but from a sort of when we begin to peel back, I think there are some real questions there, because the ability to deter depends almost entirely on the ability to respond. And it is the ability to respond that you can actually control. That's the one that you have agency over. You don't have any agency over your deterrence. That's what the other person decides. So I think in some ways I would have much rather seen a focus on the response element. And I think there's also issues there in terms of some of the narratives that the government has been quite careful to couch this in sort of vague and fluffy language. And the classic example that I dislike in particular is the idea that SSNs create big question marks. I have no idea what that means. But because we focus so much on this idea of deterrence rather than what these capabilities actually allow you to do, I think at times it's quite a difficult sell to the public and to explain more broadly what it is you're achieving. So that's one area where I have reservations. And the other one, and I guess it sort of touches on where you were at the end there, is around the focus on what I would see as the sort of the exciting and the sexy. So there's a discussion of asymmetric capability towards the end, which, as far as I can tell, doesn't necessarily in any way relate to it being asymmetric. It is this current use of the word asymmetric to mean something that's snazzy and exciting. But there is this real interest in the snazzy and the exciting. And as we'll talk about in a second, I think that in places maybe, and it's difficult to see where the decisions were made in terms of the sort of what was cut to achieve what, but I would worry that that is coming at the price of the boring but the essential. And with my historian's hat on, big wars aren't won by asymmetric capabilities; they're won by large amounts of symmetrical capability, which is put together and supported with appropriate logistics, etc. So wonder weapons always give me sort of slight concerns in that frame. So those would be my kind of two areas where I would begin to question, particularly on the NDS. We've talked quite a lot about the capability issues. Do you want to pull out a little bit more about what where some of those cuts, particularly in the maritime domain, have fallen, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to touch on your point before I go into that, I did mention before that what I liked about the National Defence Strategy, the maritime domain element, is it recognised that the maritime domain was much more than ships and submarines, which is great. But it really did give passing commentary to things like a hydrographic plan, right? We're seeing that countries competing to do oceanographic expeditions in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, and that's because it matters, right? And yet, really, Australia's capability in that space is disappearing. Our plan is to contract it out. And I'm not sure that's the right degree of focus, right? And then when you talk about some of those enabling functions, so it's good on the ships, we'll be there a little bit late, but we can talk about that later. It's good on the submarines, again, probably a little bit late, but it gets to them. But then when it goes to the reductions, so we always knew the Defence Minister had shadowed that for the National Defence Strategy, there would be a complete rehaul of the Integrated Investment Program, and that was recommended by the Defence Strategic Review, and that we would find pots of gold in it to fund new things. I do have a piece that I put out about a week ago with Aspie's the strategist talking about why there's not pots of gold in the IIP and what the IIP is. And I just mentioned before I go into the cuts that the Integrated Investment Program is not the document that was released this week. The document released this week was a 100-page glossy that tries to articulate how Defence is prioritising and spending its money, which is great because we need to communicate more with the public. But the Integrated Investment Program itself, of course, is very complex, thousands of lines that phases projects over years. I say that because what is not clear in the public-facing IIP release this week is what is the cuts, right? So normally in a white paper, even in the Force Structure Plan, the FSP in 2020, you had a list of dot points of what's going, and sometimes why, not always why. In the entire 100-page IIP, there's no list of the exact cuts. Now, you can understand from a security standpoint why you wouldn't declare all of your hands, but it is also difficult when you think about it from an industry standpoint. Now, what we do know of the cuts is certainly at the press club from a maritime perspective. Right, so the Defence Minister released this week, certainly mentioned at the press club in his speech that the Joint Support Ship for the Navy would be cut. So what was the Joint Support Ship? So the Joint Support Ship was announced in the Force Structure Plan in 2020, and think of it like HMAS Choules with a sea lift capability, but with RAS rigs bolted onto it, right? So it's meant to be a multi-purpose auxiliary ship. And if you want to think of, a global exemplar, you can Google the Karel Doorman in service with the Dutch Navy, which is kind of what the Joint Support Ship would have been like. Now, it was to achieve two things. One, HMAS Choules, although, still young to us, is actually 18 years old because we bought Choules secondhand as Largs Bay. It has proven to be a great capability for the Australian Navy. And you look up the photos of the evacuation in Malakuta to see how versatile Choules is. So the FFP decided that we needed two of Choules to increase the RAN sea lift. And we do know that sea lift in the Royal Australian Navy is a huge issue. But also, they were going to bolt the RAS rigs onto it to provide that auxiliary replenishment support, because we only have 2 tankers in the Australian Navy. That is Stalwart and Supply. Embarrassing, on ABC, I called it HMAS Success. HMAS Success has been decommissioned, for those of you that don't know, a number of years ago. But yeah, so Stalwart and Supply. Now, we know on the 3-to-1 ratio that for every 1 ship operational, you would have 1 in maintenance and 1 in training. And to be honest, it's probably worse than that, right? But so for 2 auxiliary ships, that means that we don't have a replenishment ship available to support what is meant to be an expanding fleet 365 days a year. So it made sense to expand the auxiliary capability. So the cancellation of the joint support ship really does see a hole. How do you actually replenish and sustain this growing surface combatant fleet once we actually get it? So that was one of the key cancellations that impacted Navy. The second one, which came as a surprise to some but not to others, was the decision to not progress with C-1905. So C-1905 was really the replacement of the mine hunter vessels. It had been in doubt, right? The FSP in 2020 said that the way we were going to do it, the way we're probably going to do it, was to get more OPVs. But we know that the OPV OPV program has had problems, and we saw in the Surface Combatant Fleet Review that the planned 12 OPVs was being cut to 6. So certainly that was never going to be the platform pursued to support our mine capabilities. Now, Defence or the government haven't come out and clearly said what will replace it, except for the use of autonomous underwater vessels. But you can generally think that for things like port clearance, there's going to be some sort of flyaway kit. For example, potentially the use of civilian vessels of opportunity that you could deploy these flyaway kits from at this stage. They are the main ones that impact Navy in terms of the cuts that we know of, right? Because there is probably more that has either been delayed or rescoped, but you can't tell it from the way that the IIP has been displayed as expenditure over a forward estimate or 10 years. What do you think about the cuts impacting the maritime domain?
So yeah, I have significant reservations, not merely from a kind of current peacetime sustainment type perspective, but also a lot of this is talking about projection, impactful projection, all of this kind of narrative, which involves going places, right? And being able to sustain a growing surface fleet at distance is something that is a real challenge. We know this is a huge challenge, not only for the Royal Australian Navy, it's a challenge for navies around the world, that we don't have enough support ships broadly, whether that be the Brits with their issues with the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, the Americans are also looking at similar kind of issues. So it seems like a really odd time to be cutting rather than actually expanding in this. And I think similarly with the MCM capability, again, you want to be operating in the waters to the north of Australia. In many ways, they are ideal waters for mine warfare. And that's why it is really good to see Australia embracing mine warfare itself again. But at the same time, that is going to be an absolutely essential capability, and relying on picking up a civilian vessel when you need it or being able to fly these kind of things in seems like, again, a real kind of step backwards. And once again, it's strange that this is something that is being seen across a number of navies at this time, and this kind of reliance on sort of autonomous kit and being able to then just plug and play, which, from what I understand, is, whilst there's a lot of potential there and that things are moving in that direction, I don't think we're necessarily in a world where all of this is just going to work smoothly or even sort of close to that as of yet. So it seems like there are some very significant kind of gaps there, which to my mind, again, speak to some of the sort of the issues of credibility around some of the concepts that are being discussed.
I gave a speech at the Williams Foundation Multi-Domain Maritime Strategy seminar last week, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. And I do wonder that a lot of this comes from the fact that we've never had this coherent maritime strategy. You know, and I won't harp on it about it too much here, but I think if you look at the AUKUS decision You look at how the Surface Combatant Fleet review and then subsequent decision came about. There's a lot of capability driving strategy, which means when you do that, you don't necessarily see the gaps, and the gaps are often in the enabling capabilities. Now, it was good to see in the NDS that there's certainly a theme of theatre logistics, which is great. But when you think about, the maritime domain and maritime strategy, we talked about the gaps there in mine warfare potentially, the gaps in sea lift, the gaps in replenishment. We haven't dived into it, but I think we have a whole issue in terms of our hydrographic capability. And I do note that in the National Defence Strategy, the word cable, undersea cable, subsea cable, I've done a quick search, couldn't find it anywhere. Also can't see it mentioned in our civilian maritime strategy. So I guess there are some gaps that are of a concern. So, Richard, I guess we've talked a fair bit about the National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Program, and we could spend hours pulling it apart, as I mentioned before.
Oh, that'd be fun, wouldn't it?
It would be fun. Some people will do. Moving on to some of the other things that happened in the week. So, from an operations perspective, there's been some significant developments in the Middle East. Do you want to touch on some of them?
Yeah, so it seems like quite a long time ago, but at the very end of last week, beginning of this week, obviously the Iranian attacks on Israel. And whilst much of the focus within this has been on the activities of both the Israeli missile defense system and sort of allied air forces in shooting down lots and lots of the drones, there was also a significant naval component. 2 American DDGs engaged. So this is the USS Carney and the USS Arleigh Burke, engaged ballistic missiles from positions in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this obviously fits into the narrative that's been going on and playing out in the Red Sea for some time. And I think it once again highlights the fact that this is a mature capability. There have been lots of questions for as long as I can remember about whether or not ballistic missile defense is a plausible thing. Will it work when it needs to? Well, at the moment, at least, certainly with the Iranian missiles, it seems to be working very successfully. So that's a really important point to be sort of flagging, particularly with some of these narratives that have been going around of sort of surface ships are redundant and all these missiles are always going to get through. Well, I think the reality is somewhat different there. And then I guess the other sort of development was just prior to this was the Iranian seizure of the container ship, the MSC Ares, as it was progressing through, coming out of the Persian Gulf. So just sort of near the Straits of Hormuz. Again, this is something that is not new. We've seen this type of thing before. But there's some really interesting kind of question marks there about whether or not the Iranians will continue to push this obvious kind of nerve that they've got, this the button that they can press to influence matters in terms of that crucial choke point. So I must say I thought that would be one of the sort of major steps that they took, and then obviously they launched this very large attack on Israel, and that's kind of gone into the background. Whether or not the Straits of Hormuz comes back again, I certainly would not be surprised to see. What about you, Jen? Your thoughts?
I think interesting, and lots kind of resonates for Australian maritime security. I think on the efforts of USS Carney and Arleigh Burke, it really was good to see the ballistic missile defense capability proven. It was reported as the first operational use of SM-3, and they intercepted about 7 ballistic missiles, is the reporting. So, I mean, from an Australian perspective, we said in the Surface Combatant Fleet Review that we would expedite the ballistic missile defence upgrade of the 3 Hobarts. So the 3 Hobarts are meant to go through a baseline 9 Aegis upgrade to really strengthen that capability, which is a huge issue in terms of Australia's defence. A lot of questions about our ballistic missile defence capability. But I guess it should give us some confidence in the Aegis combat system as a BMD capable combat system. Australia is not acquiring SM3, certainly not listed in the National Defence Strategy, but we are getting the more modern and more versatile SM6, which kind of builds on some of the SM3 capabilities. So it should give us some confidence there in terms of that capability. I think in terms of the Aries, look, what we are seeing is that states such as Iran, but not only Iran, see that interfering with shipping is a way to send a political message and a strategic message. And we saw this in 2019, 2020 in the Gulf crisis, where we saw a number of ships limpet mined by Iran in the Gulf of Oman, and then we saw the Stena and Perro seized. Now, as much as it hasn't really made the news, since then, we've seen a number of ships seized by Iran. Now, some of that is actually ships that are smuggling from Iran. So some of that is legitimate maritime law enforcement. The seizure of the Aries was not. We don't get a lot of the reporting here in Australia, but we do know there has been a tit for tat between Israel and Iran when it comes to shipping in the Middle East for quite some time. There was the mysterious explosions on board an Iranian flagged vessel rumored to be a intelligence collecting ship in the Red Sea a couple of years ago. There's been drones and missiles lobbed. So we do know that interference with shipping, as I said before, is a way to send a political and strategic message. And it's something that we do need to think about in terms of, if you think about Australia's defence and Australia's vulnerabilities, and the Defence Minister highlighted in launching the NDS this week, shipping is our major vulnerability. And so you could expect, on the road between competition to crisis to conflict, hoping that crisis and conflict don't happen, that interference with Australian shipping would be one of those escalatory measures, right? So there's some lessons for us there. I thought it interesting too that there was a lot of conversation that some commentators expected that Iran would respond by closing the Strait of Hormuz. It's always rumored that they'll close it, they'll mine it. I think that that's a little bit short-sighted, because when you think about how Iran actually gets its exports out, it actually gets a lot of it through the Strait of Hormuz. So it would significantly impact Iran as well. But look, some really interesting developments and some clear lessons for Australia, and some things about the Aegis Combat System and its BMD capability that should really give us some confidence in the upgrades for our Hobarts moving forward.
Yeah, the only thing I'd then sort of add to that is one of the things that I thought was quite interesting, again, coming out of the Aries seizure, is this question which has come up with a number of the ships attacked in the Red Sea over quite who owns it, who's got responsibility for it, all of this kind of stuff. It's sort of appears to be a Mediterranean shipping company ship, but in fact, the vessel is actually owned by an Israeli behind the scenes. So that might well have played into the decision to attack that particular vessel over something else. But it once again is highlighting this sort of real question and an issue in terms of, as geopolitical tensions at sea ramp up, the way we've created the modern sort of shipping world makes it actually incredibly difficult to understand who owns what, who needs what, and how those sort of networks of and relationships of sort of insurance ownership, cargo, crew, all of that play out in a kind of a transnational kind of way.
You're right. I do have a bit of a theory, one that I probably don't have time to flesh out right here, but I do wonder that in the event of conflict, whether we would actually see a trend away from flags of convenience, right?
Yep.
So
Flight
it's
to flag.
convenient, right? It's convenient right now because it's cheap. You can go with countries that don't really specify too many regulations, or certainly don't enforce the regulations. However, you're not assured protection, right? And certainly, I'm not sure if the Red Sea is a great example right now, but during the 2019-2020 Gulf crisis, when the International Maritime Security Construct was stood up to protect the Straits of Hormuz, there was a real question about whether they were interested in ships that were flagged to countries that were not part of IMSC and what protection they would afford. So I do think that there is a question about whether that trend might decrease in the event of conflict, but hypothetical.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one to see. I think there has already been a little bit of flight from flags of convenience, and you are already also seeing at least suggestions that American warships are in closer concert to American flagged vessels and American owned vessels in the Red Sea. Whether or not that's true, it's very difficult to tell, but it certainly would make a lot of sense.
So, Richard, we've covered off on strategy and operations in the last week, but there's been some interesting capability developments. What are the ones that kind of sprung to mind for you?
Oh, well, the one that I guess leaps out, or maybe shouldn't leap out, which was coming out yesterday, is the update in terms of the Ghost Shark, the extra large UUV uncrewed underwater vehicle, which the Australian government, Australian Navy, has been collaborating with Anduril on developing. And they had a sort of supposed prototype, and they've now come up with something that looks far more, in some ways, I think, realistic as the sort of the first real prototype. And so it's interesting to see. Again, we get quite a lot of the spin. Trying to unpick the reality from the spin is quite difficult with these sorts of things for obvious reasons. In many ways, it looks very similar to the Boeing American developed Orca, certainly from its sort of outward appearance and probable role. The main areas flagged in terms of potential capability was ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Absolutely no surprise there. Although there was one mention of strike, which flagged immediately with me. I have no idea what they're on about, but we might unpick that at some point. The other commonly expected role for these sorts of things is mine laying. So that would be something else to see. The statements made quite a lot as well of Australian industry involvement, which again is quite good to see from a sort of a resilience and industry development perspective. But as always, it's again in some ways quite difficult to unpick the government spin from what actually is going on behind the scenes. But if that is the case, then that's obviously excellent to see. How about yourself?
I thought that was interesting. Flagging, well, I think it was at least in the Anduril press release that, which is what a lot of the news seemed to be derived from, which it was, one of the few defence projects which is on budget and ahead of time. To be fair, it's easy for people to throw stones, but most defence projects are on budget and ahead of time, just not the really big expensive ones like the Hunter class project or the Thou Shall Not Be Named previous attack class project, right? But look, I think it's really interesting. I think it's great to see it being built in Australia. I think someone said 42 Australian defence companies involved in it. Of course, Anduril is not, although it's called Anduril Australia, is actually a subsidiary of a US company. But I think that's great. And their intent is to develop 3 prototypes. Not clear on the operational concepts there, not clear on the payloads. Obviously mine laying seems an obvious one. But look, I think it is good to see. But we need to be careful not to overhype it. And you and I have spoken a lot about uncrewed capabilities. They certainly have a place. And I do like the concept of a hybrid fleet. But I don't think they replace conventional capabilities and really won't mitigate this gap that we're looking at that we mentioned at the start of the podcast in terms of surface ships and submarines.
Absolutely not. And I thought actually, I now can't remember off the top of my head whether it was in the integrated investment program or the national defence strategy, but there was a discussion actually of the way in which the focus in terms of maritime autonomy is going to be on sort of smaller platforms and more sort of attritable platforms focused on ISR, which makes a huge amount of sense, and I thought was actually really quite good to see. So things like this, the really big, flashy, expensive stuff, is in many ways the exception, and the smaller, cheaper things that are more like the blue bottle or the sail drone, as the American version, are far more likely to be the sort of the reality for some time to come.
You're right, and it was good actually to see the Blue Bottle by Blue Zone, which is an Australian company, was called out in the Integrated Investment Program. And in fact, that focus on autonomy, I think the Defence Minister said that, over the forward estimates, there is a new $1 billion, 200 million of which will go towards autonomy. So I think that is good, but we just need to be careful of the statements that USVs replace ships, for example. I guess the other interesting capability that I was pretty excited about, and again, I'm not sure how much is propaganda, but it's the Dragonfire laser that the Royal Navy have put out a statement about in the last week. So there were some trials off Scotland and some videos released earlier this year. And the Royal Navy's come out this week and said that the Dragonfire laser has proven that it will be capable against missiles and UAVs. And there is a footage going around of it destroying a stationary UAV. Sorry, it's not fitted to a ship. But it's really cool, I think, to see directed energy weapons, which is actually a technology priority in Australia's national defence strategy, being pursued. Now, the UK have been working on this for a while, I think 10 years or so, but originally they were going to have it delivered into the fleet in 2032. So the big announcement this week is that they intend to have it integrated in the fleet by 2027. And they've said that as part of that, they have reviewed their acquisition processes to get this done quicker. So if it's not propaganda, if it is as effective as they say it is, which, I guess scientifically it makes sense, and if they can actually get it on their ships by 2027, not just their ships, they're also talking about putting on their infantry fighting vehicles and aircraft. I'm not sure about the aircraft bit, but then that I think will be quite significant, right? And we look at the Red Sea, and one of the criticisms has been the cost of an SM2, I can't remember, $2 million or whatever it is, right, against the drone. Now, I would argue that, well, it's actually the drone, the cost of that ship, and the lives of the people on it. But either way, right, we know that when you have limited magazines, we've talked about the fact that we have limited replenishment ships, the Royal Australian Navy. We haven't talked about the fact that, but it's true, that we can't replenish missiles at sea at the moment. Things like directed energy weapons, I think, are really exciting. So if it is as good as they say it is, and if they can put it on their ships by 2027, I think this is a really significant thing. What do you reckon?
Oh, absolutely. There are a few projects sort of like this floating around, and I've got a degree of skepticism. I'm naturally a cynic, so and we've sort of heard announcements a bit like this before, but it does seem that this is now the RN saying that it's sort of operational. It's at that level, so this would be amazing, and particularly in terms of precisely what you're saying about sort of limited magazines and the potential for kind of mass, particularly the sort of more drone element of this, the sort of the lower tech side of things. This could be a really, really important development. It also, to me, the other thing that immediately jumped out with the sort of the push towards directed energy weapons is the requirement for kind of large surpluses in terms of energy and power on warships. And this is often sort of a point of concern or issue with some of the sort of current designs and plans for current combatants, is that they actually don't have a huge margin in these kind of areas to add on additional systems like directed energy weapons. So that's something else that's kind of worth thinking about, particularly as we look at things like Hunter, where supposedly this has been something of a challenge, sort of both weight and power margins. So there's something there to keep in mind as well.
No. Okay, Richard, so we've covered off on a lot of key developments this week, from strategy to funding to operations to lasers, not quite on sharks, but pretty cool, to undersea drones or UUVs and the Andrews Ghost Shark. I guess one of the things we said when we talked about the structure of this podcast is we are keen to kind of hark back a little bit to our history as well and some unknown concepts. And so what is the unknown concept that we're going to quickly end on today?
So we're going to talk briefly today about something called the Sandison Line. The Sandison Line is sort of got almost mythic qualities amongst a very, very small group of kind of Australian maritime strategy geeks, such as ourselves. But for those of you who do know the Sandison Line, you probably know it from Australian Maritime Doctrine, where it was, unsurprisingly, of course, picked up by James Goldrick. Who else? But the concept originates actually with a guy called Lieutenant Commander J.M. Sandison, who was writing in the 1980s and was interested in the protection of Australian trade. So something that's really relevant, really important today. And what he was looking at was basically who interferes with trade and why. And one of the areas he was interested in is the idea that people interfere with trade, or countries feel free to interfere with trade, where that trade can only be going into one particular place. So if you can identify that this is only going to your particular target or hostile country, then countries feel far more sort of free to interfere with that trade. So he developed what was known as the Sandison Line, which is basically it's two huge sweeping arcs across the Indian Ocean and across the Pacific Ocean. And these arcs demonstrate from where anywhere within those arcs, trade or ships found can only be going, if they're on any kind of economic route, will only be going to Australia. So there's a very large swathe of sea around Australia where an adversary, if they find shipping, they can reasonably assume that it's going to be heading to Australia. Now, obviously, these arcs meet up to the north of Australia, near the archipelago, and that is the area where that line is actually very close to the Australian coast. Other than that, the idea sort of behind the line, or the premise behind the line, is that for an adversary, it's actually very easy to identify Australia's trade and to be able to then target that trade at a very significant distance from Australia. And this speaks directly to some of the issues that have been raised recently and sort of discussions around protecting Australian trade. And I've been yabbering on about this in sort of part of the ASPI blog recently in response to a very interesting ASPI report on trade. But it also speaks to some of the statements that have been made by Richard Marles and others around the drivers for AUKUS and the requirements to be able to effectively have a degree of sea control across a very large swathe of water. Why? Precisely because of these sorts of things, that adversaries can identify Australian trade from a long way out and can potentially target it from a long way out as well. So Sandison Line, interesting concept, something that I think perhaps more people within the Australian defence debate should be aware of. And if you're really interested in it, you can find a full discussion of it in an article in the Pacific Defence Review from April 1986. So we're harking back properly into the Defence of Australia days.
Great. Well, thanks, Richard. A really interesting concept. We'll put a link to the explanation of the Sandison Line in the show notes. But I think that's probably all we have time for today. When we started this podcast, we weren't sure if there was going to be a lot of content if we did it weekly. But as we can see from this week, there is a significant amount of things happening in the maritime domain that impact Australia's national security. And really, it's getting corny now, but it just goes to show that maritime matters.
Certainly does. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Richard.